In the same folder, you'll find a file called Socket to Me, because his eye socket is too dark. Before we move on to the non-destructive stuff, I do want to talk about the actual dodge and burn tools. With the soft light, we're a little bit limited in, where we can kind of affect stuff. Like if we wanted to only affect the shadows more than the highlights, it's not as functional as the actual burn tool. But be aware, as we said, the burn tool is destructive. But there may be times where you might be able to get a more realistic effect. Or there may be times where you're just in a frickin' hurry. Like maybe you got 20, 30 images you got to get through. And you're just, I'm going to darken, I'm going to do some retouching, and I want to just get on with it. Always make a duplicate of your original layer. And just be aware that this is destructive. So let's say I did a duplicate of it, and just follow along on the screen here. I just want to show you how these actual dodge and burn tools, the different things that they can offer you. By default, they're set to midtones and protect tones. And I'm going to do the exposure 100% just so you can really see what's going on here. And if I use the burn tool, you can see that, hey, the midtones, it's really hitting those midtones. It's not really doing much to the highlight. See on the tip of his nose? Not a whole lot going on there. On his, the forehead highlight, not a whole lot going on. And it's really not touching the shadows very much at all either. So it's kind of avoiding the highlights, it's kind of avoiding the shadows. It's really hitting those midtones. There's before and there's after. Now the protect tones, notice how the color of the skin stays the same. The saturation stays the same. If you don't have the protect tones turned on, you'll notice that the skin gets a little bit of an oversaturated sort of look. There's before and there's after. So the protect tones just make sure that the saturation isn't going to get messed up with this burn tool here. Now, that was midtones. We also have, oh, look at this, shadows. So let's say we wanted to darken down the shadow areas. Maybe we want to leave the tip of the nose alone. Look at that, it's not affecting the tip of the nose. It's getting those shadows, oh geez, a whole lot darker. Not affecting the midtones so much, but like the hair, really darkening that effect down. Yeah, it is a little bit creepy. Or we can go the opposite route. We could say instead of shadows, let's do highlights. Notice it's barely affecting the hair at all. It's barely doing anything to the midtones. Now it does something interesting to the highlights. Oh, it's just kind of putting a grayish cast over them. And let's talk about why for a second. If I really zoom in here, and if I took a look at the RGB values for this, 240, 230, 220. It's really bright in that area. Now there isn't a whole lot of information for it to pull down. Like, imagine that elastic string, you grab the middle bead, here's black, here's white. These are tones that are down around here. And if I grab this middle bead and start pulling, well, this bead would move a lot. This bead wouldn't move as much, and the ones that are right beside 255 would barely move at all. In fact, when you use this highlights mode, it's really kind of taking your white point bead and moving the whole bead down. Basically saying, let's put a little bit of, 255, 255, 255 across red, green, and blue. Let's just pull all of these down, which kind of puts a grayish cast. Let's say you go from 255 down to 245. You've gone down 10 points. If all three go down, it's not white, it's a really light gray, which is kind of what we're getting in here, a really light gray kind of thrown over top. There's before and there's after with the highlights mode turned on. Now that's with protect tone. Let's try it without the protect tones. And here it is just on the highlights. Same deal, but if anything, even worse. So if you're losing highlight information, don't think that you can just go in with a burn tool and get those highlights back, especially on something like a wedding dress or someone's face detail where we're starting to blow out some highlights. And really that wasn't even so bad. So I wouldn't rely too much on these the dodge and burn tool there. Now the dodge tool, same sort of deal. We've got midtones where it will try to lighten up the midtones. Not so much on the shadow areas, not so much on the highlight areas. That's the midtones. Same deal with the shadows. It'll lighten up the shadows pretty good, like, the hair, the eye sockets. Midtones won't affect as much, and it'll basically ignore those highlight areas. All right. And the highlights, we can make the highlights even lighter, and it'll ignore the hair. So there are some capabilities of the dodge and burn tool that you don't necessarily get to take advantage of when you're using the soft light dodge and burn layer. Now the advantage is, let's say I did a whole bunch of cloning and fixed up all the little blemishes and softened the skin, and then did some burning around, and the client was like, it's great, except for the burning. I can't really undo that burning, can I? If I've done all my retouching on this layer and my burning on this layer, I could switch to a dodge tool and lighten it back up, but that's like grabbing the middle bead and now grabbing the new, you've damaged this file twice. So by working on a new transparent layer and using your soft light dodge and burn, so grabbing a paintbrush and painting with black and white, keeps it nice and non-destructive. So let's give that a try. Call up the image. I'm just going to revert back to the original there. And let's say that this eye socket is too dark. Like if you look in the eyes, you can see a catch light, but this is a fill light coming straight from the front. The actual main light, the key light, is coming from above, and it's coming in at such a steep angle that his eyebrow is casting a shadow when we're getting that kind of raccoon eye thing going on in there. I'm thinking it would be nice to lighten up these little areas around in here. Now, we're going to do this at a really low opacity. It's going to be really annoying. I often see people say, oh, I want to lighten up the eyes. Let me take a brush like this big and go across here, and they lighten this up and this part around here. This is all we need to lighten. So let's take an appropriately sized brush. First, I'm going to make that new transparent layer. I'm going to pop that from normal into soft light blending mode. And I'm going to take a smaller brush, and I want a really low opacity, maybe 10%, so if you hit 1 on the keyboard. And to lighten her up, make sure I have pure white, so I hit D on the keyboard. Gives me black, so I hit X, there we go. And I'll just lighten that area a bit. If it looks like it's getting a little bit blotchy, just try to go back and hit the darkest parts to lighten those up. You butchered his face. Well, the nice thing about this technique, guys, let's say you did accidentally, I don't know, butcher his face. You could grab your eraser tool, just hit E on the keyboard, and you can go right over top of that problem area, and then hit B, you're right back to your paintbrush, and you can start again. So B for butcher and B for brush. Now, as it lightens, you might notice something weird happening with the saturation. Looking at your screen, turn that eyeball off and on, and what do you notice about the saturation in that area where it's been lightened? The saturation's dropping a little bit, isn't it? Like if you turn it off and see the original darkness of it, there's a certain saturation. Like see how the skin has this kind of saturated skin tone color to it. And so did the shadows. But now that I've lightened it up with soft light, it's a little less saturated. And let's talk about why. Let's say you're retouching somebody that had like a bright blue shirt on or a bright blue sweater, and then there was a fold, a wrinkle in that sweater. When you get a fold, you might get a really dark shadow on there. In fact, if it was like folded enough, and let's say it was like a really high contrast, you know, a really strong key light and no reflector, it might even be black. So you might get a nice beautiful blue on the sweater here, and then a wrinkle and a black shadow. If you try to lighten up that shadow, well, what kind of saturation does black have? 0, 0, 0, no saturation. Maybe the shadow isn't totally black. Maybe it's just really dark getting close to black, and you start lightening that up. That lower saturation will start to show up in the brighter part of the image. And that's kind of what's happening in here. The original image was really dark. You can see how dark it was in there. If it had been black, it would have no saturation. It wasn't quite black, but it was really dark. And as I lighten it up, that lower saturation is remaining. Soft light isn't the only blending mode that we can use to dodge and burn. Overlay seems to hold that saturation a little bit better. If I turn this layer now off and on, it didn't get as light as it did with soft light. Like soft light kind of punches it up a bit more, but it doesn't lose that saturation. So maybe I can just go in with that paintbrush again and do a little bit more lightening, and I can keep some of that saturation in there. In the case of the eye socket, overlay seems a little bit more appropriate. Okay, now let's say we also wanted to do some burning. I often find that if you do a little bit of darkening around the hairline, you can kind of, help frame someone's face, maybe bring down these highlights a bit, maybe do some, kind of darkening around here. Let's see what happens if we do some burning on this overlay layer. Let's say I took my paintbrush and hit X to get my black paint. Maybe we'll bring the opacity up maybe 20% or so, and I'll do a little bit of darkening along the hairline there. Maybe bring down some of this brightness in the temple, and maybe I'll do a little bit of burning along. Uh-oh. What's happening to the color in here? Yeah, the saturation is increasing. It looks like a boiled lobster or something. Here's before and here's after. Now, in the case of the eye, when we were lightening, keeping that saturation was a good thing. But in this case, that's a pretty saturated color in there. As it gets darker, as it gets closer to here, it goes towards a lower saturation. So we would expect that saturation to drop, but with the overlay, it isn't. What? Soft light seems to look better. Overlay looks good in the eye socket. Soft light, not as good. Overlay, good. But for the temple there, soft light, good. Overlay, not good. Now they're on the same layer. What can I do about that? We can have 2 layers. No one says you can't have more than one dodge and burn layer. So I'm going to undo all that stuff. I'm going to make, and actually, you know what? It's not a bad idea to name your layers as you go. So I'm going to call this one D&B Overlay. And I'll make another one, which I will call D&B Soft. I got to capitalize that. Soft Light. If I pop this into soft light blending mode, grab my paintbrush, now I can do all that burning, all that darkening, without causing that increase in saturation. So no one says you can't have more than one dodge and burn layer. Just try not to get layers fighting each other. Like if you have one layer down here that's really brightening an area, and then throw another layer up above that's darkening that area, those 2 layers are going to be fighting each other and you'll be losing shades of gray. But as long as they're not in the same area or going the same direction, you should be fine. Let's say you did want to do some retouching. Like, let's say I wanted to remove this blemish on his forehead up here. Where might be a good place to put that retouching layer? Above or below my dodge and burn layers? Below. How did you guys know that? Well, let's look at the problems that can occur if I do it above. If I make a new transparent layer here, grab a clone stamp, and I'm like, hey, I'm just going to sample some of this texture, and I'll throw that over top, and it looks absolutely fine. Except that these pixels were made based on the darkened version of this image. If I turn off these layers, that is now too dark up there. It was fine before, now it's too dark. But if, as you guys already seemed to know, I put the retouching layer at the bottom of my darkening stack, exact same thing, it looks just fine, but those pixels were created with the original color of his skin in mind. So if I turn these off, look at that, it looks just fine. So yeah, retouching should be below these layers here. So give that a try as well. Do some retouching. Zoom in, see if you can get rid of some of the little blemishes. See if you can soften some of the wrinkles. See if you can soften some of the skin texture. And if you're working on a transparent layer with the clone stamp, do make sure that your stamp is set to current and below. If you're working below the dodge and burn layers and you have your stamp set to, well, if you have it set to current layer, nothing's going to happen because your current layer is transparent. But if you have it set to all layers, just take a look on the screen for a second and see what happens here. If I've got my tool, my clone stamp, set to all layers, and I sample this here, it's going to take into account those darker layers up above, and I'll end up with too dark of a patch. So just watch out for that. Make sure that your brush is set to current and below, so it'll ignore these layers up above. guys, blemishes are one thing, like we've picked out some blemishes around here, but what about just overall skin texture? Look at this texture around in here. Maybe you want to soften that texture out. A fairly simple way I find of softening out skin texture is still that clone stamp. You know, fairly low opacity, maybe like 20% or so, and always a soft brush, always that hardness down at 0. But let's say I wanted to soften out this texture in here. First off, gradients. There's always gradients in an image. Here you can see it goes from dark to light. So if I were to sample, say, like, here to here, it would darken the pixels down. Here we got, again, dark to light. But as long as I go perpendicular to those gradients, I shouldn't be changing the brightness at all. But with this low opacity, let's say I sampled perpendicular to this gradient here. We got dark to light. I'm going to go this direction, so I sample here, doink, and I move it down to here. At 20%, it's pretty subtle, but you can see how the bright areas kind of get darkened a little bit. The dark areas kind of get lightened a little bit. You get this averaging out. And because I'm taking skin texture, it doesn't overly soften it. I mean, if I kept going back and forth, it would eventually start to soften it out. But if I need it a little bit more intense, maybe I can grab a little bit of this and still going perpendicular to the gradient, grab a bit of this and maybe throw some of that over top. And there's a before and there's an after. Same kind of deal. Let's say this I thought was a little bit too rough in here. Gradient goes this way, I'll clone this way, grab a bit of this, throw it over top. Grab a bit of this, throw it over top. There's a before and there's an after. So the texture remains. You don't want to soften skin out to the point where it has that waxy kind of Barbie doll sort of look to it. And to a certain extent, this could also be used for dodging and burning. Like let's say I wanted to lighten up this area in here. I could pop over to one of my dodge and burn things, maybe like my overlay here, and with a paintbrush, I could lighten up in there. But if I'm already doing some retouching, let's say I'm on this layer here with my clone stamp, and I grabbed a little bit of this lighter texture and threw that over top, there it is at 20%, that gives a nice kind of lightening effect in there while softening some of the skin texture at the same time.